Hello, everyone. My name is Nikki Wu, and I'm a first-year student studying at New York University's Washington, D.C. Global Academic Center. I'm excited to introduce you to today's DC Dialogues webinar, Gender and Race Inequalities in Sport, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest speakers for this discussion, including Nnenna Akotaobi, the principal and founder of the 122 Consulting Group LLC and the executive director of the Black Women in Sport Foundation, Paige Nielsen, professional soccer player for DC's very own Washington Spirit, Brianna Pinto, a current student athlete on the women's soccer team at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Kim Wyant, the head coach for NYU's men's soccer team, and currently the only female head coach of an NCAA men's soccer team. And lastly, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Professor Cameron Myler, a clinical assistant professor at NYU's Tisch Institute for Global Sport, an arbitrator with the Court of Arbitration for Sport, an intellectual property and sports lawyer, and a four-time Olympian in the sport of luge. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions, which we will address towards the end of the program. Thanks so much for joining this discussion, and I'd now like to hand it off to Professor Myler to begin the conversation.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are really excited to have you here today for DC Dialogues, Gender and Race Inequalities in Sport. We've got a fantastic panel and we welcome your questions. So if you do have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A and we will we'll take those as they come in. So to kick things off here, I'm going to ask our panelists just to talk for a few minutes about their background, what they're currently doing, and how they got theirs. So why don't we start with Nnenna?
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and continuing this ongoing discussion about the intersection of social justice and sport, critically important. So Nnenna Akotaobi, I use she and her pronouns, and I run a consulting firm where we help organizations think strategically about diversity and inclusive excellence. Many of our clientele are college sports teams and professional sport teams. So we work collaboratively to design strategies to create spaces where people can thrive and being thoughtful about what that looks like. I also serve as the executive director of a foundation called the Black Women in Sport Foundation that has a history of developing grassroots programming for Black girls and Black women, frankly, to kind of close the gap for opportunities, particularly in non-traditional sports like fencing, lacrosse, field hockey. It's a nearly 30-year-old foundation with a storied history, and one of the first when we were founded in 1992, but more broadly thinking about how do we create opportunity and facilitate opportunity. Prior to that, I spent most of my professional career in college sports, doing similar national advocacy work and work on campuses. Again, supporting coaches, supporting student athletes, and then nationally crafting strategy to say, how do we really be thoughtful about diversity and inclusive excellence in sport? I'm a Colorado native, born and raised, and formerly played in my former life Division I basketball at the University of Denver. Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nnenna. How about Paige?
Hi, everyone. Paige Nielsen. I am a professional soccer player for the Washington Spirit. I am a proud UNC Chapel Hill alum, and I've been playing professional soccer for 6 years now. I'm older, sorry. And I have played in Australia, South Korea, Germany, Spain, Cyprus, Seattle. I got drafted to Seattle originally, and I forewent a lot of job opportunities to pursue what I love. And I am now here in Washington, D.C. with the Spirit and just signed for another 3 years. So I'll be here for a while.
Thanks, Paige. Brianna?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Pinto. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm a junior at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm majoring in business administration. I'm also a part of the UNC women's soccer team, and I played for Anson Dorrance, who many of us know and love. So I've been involved with the U.S. national team since I was 12 and have represented the national team at every level. for the youth teams and a brief stint with the senior team as well. I love soccer because it's given me the opportunity to travel the world and learn about different cultures and interact with a wide range of people who have different experiences in life. Currently, I'm a part of the U.S. Soccer Athlete Council, and I'm looking to push for more diversity, inclusion, and equity within the U.S. Soccer Federation. I believe that our game is a worldwide game that everybody knows and loves, and in order for us to foster success at the highest levels, we need to make sure that we're offering opportunity to everybody, including those in lower socioeconomic communities. So I'm pushing for that right now, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm equally excited to learn from these women. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Brianna. Kim?
Well, thanks for having me, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. And it's great to follow these young soccer players who have professional contracts now, and Brianna representing the women's national team and all the great things that they're doing on the world stage, soon to be a professional, I'm sure. And I sort of, I guess I bookend or I begin this journey of women's soccer. I'm a first generation women's soccer player in this country. I'm a direct beneficiary of Title IX, which I'm sure that we'll talk about here. My high school, I didn't play soccer until high school, which is considered very, very late in today's developing soccer players. And I think that my high school team, I don't have all the facts, but I think that my high school team started because of Title IX in about 1980. And the University of Central Florida gave me a scholarship to go to college to play soccer. So the women's national team started shortly after that in 1985. And so I was able to now see the world traveling through the women's national team. And we don't have a lot of time, but fast forward to my life now, and I was involved in coaching women's soccer and soccer at every level that you could imagine. And I now find myself as the head coach of the men's soccer team at New York University, and I'm heading into my 6th season.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question for Nnenna, but anyone else can feel free to jump in with comments. So Nnenna, you mentioned that a lot of the work you're doing is at the intersection of social justice and sport. And I'd like to ask, how do you see sport being used as a vehicle to promote social justice?
Yeah, I mean, it almost in many ways flies in the face of the common refrain of stick to sports, right? I think the classic archetype of what it means to either participate in sport or coach sport is that sport is the great equalizer, and that everybody has the same access to opportunities and you come together for a common goal. And while I think that those things are true, what actually plays out and what the reality is most of us bring our full selves into sport and we don't check those identities at the door, right? So how do we create an environment through sport so folks can bring their full selves into those spaces? And more importantly, how do we leverage the relationship our world, our societies, particularly here in the US, how do we leverage the relationship we have with sport to facilitate change and to create avenues for access and to change lives and to teach all of those lessons that we articulate that sport is supposed to teach, but knowing not everybody has access to those same lessons, not everybody operates the same way. And I'm sure Kim and others who coach can probably speak to this, the way you coach athletes has evolved too, because of the evolution of that common refrain. How do you meet people where they are in order to set them up for success? And I think a lot of coaches wrestle with what that looks like, and really being able to leverage sport as a vehicle for social justice and a just society, I think fills that gap, right? How do we meet communities where they are? How do we leverage these platforms and our nation's relationship with sport to institute change? And that's kind of the only way I see sport in many ways.
Yeah, for me, Nnenna mentioned that sport is the great equalizer. And I think that's really important because as more women get involved with sport at every level, I believe it empowers us to become strong, confident young women, and that translates into other spaces. So for me personally, I've learned how to use my voice in an intentional way to advocate for those who don't have a voice that's previously like gone unheard. And I want to make sure that if I'm being given a platform and I'm earning a platform as I go, and I want to make sure that I use it in the most beneficial way possible to make sure that I bring along the next generation of athletes so that they have more opportunities than I did. And I can say Kim's generation has definitely done that for me and for Paige. And I don't think like our journey in US soccer or with the NWSL for her would be as impactful as it is now. And then in terms of social justice, I want to make sure that we value every single athlete as a human being first. We're not just athletes. We have stories to tell. We have qualities that we bring to every space. And I think people often forget that because we have a wide range of talents that we bring to the highest levels. We're so much more than just entertainers. And I want to make sure that we remind people that sport is the greatest way to bring a level playing field for everybody.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, like, sport, having opportunities to travel overseas globally, sport is like the connection that we all have with each other throughout our country, throughout our world. And sports is a microcosm of society. Like, you'll see pay, visibility, and perception inequalities all over. And when you see that like growth in sports, hopefully it goes over to women in tech, to all these other things, because sports is definitely like the interconnectedness of our entire world.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say sports was a major game changer for me. I grew up in the 70s, and as a young girl, I played sports outside, and luckily my parents and my family supported that. But there was a stigma that was associated with that. I was called a tomboy, and I didn't quite know what that meant, but I guess it was something that was derogatory, but never mind. I just persisted. And luckily I had parents who supported me on that. And again, I go back to Title IX and some of the leaders in the US making big statements and making big changes, which had major impacts on my life personally. I have 2 young girls now, and when they were 3 and 4, they were involved in every type of sport that you can imagine. And the shift in society towards girls playing sports has been massive just in my lifetime, because it was unusual for girls when I was a kid to be involved in sports. But now it's almost unusual if young girls aren't involved in sports from a young age.
I just want to follow up on something that Brianna said about having a platform as an athlete, and I think that we all do, and there's such a great opportunity to speak to issues that matter to you. And I'm an athlete ambassador for a nonprofit organization called Kids Play International, and the mission is to use sport to promote gender equity. And we work in countries impacted by genocide, so we have community sports programs in Rwanda and Cambodia. And I have to say that the first time I went to Rwanda to work at the program, it was really like one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had connected to sport. And that, I feel like that's saying something, given that I competed in the Olympics 4 times and I carried the flag at the opening ceremonies. But sport is so powerful and is really a great way to promote positive change. So, all right. So with that, maybe we'll go to Paige. Could you talk a little bit about what challenges, additional challenges you might face as a female soccer player? I know this last year there have been a lot of issues and lawsuits with regard to unequal pay with the U.S. Soccer Federation, but maybe you could talk about a little bit about what challenges you face as a female soccer player.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for like 4 days about this. simple fact is the U.S. lawsuit is fighting for equal pay, which they bring in. I just read an article. They bring in more revenue, more profit. They have made history with the most watched U.S. World Cup games, and they're still getting paid only 38% of the men. And that it goes to this entire institutional discrimination towards gender with U.S. soccer. And U.S. soccer, mind you, is a nonprofit trying to allow everyone, women and men, to play soccer, and there's still not this equality that we need. More than 90% of sports played on TV go to men, and that allows people to connect with these players, to watch the men, which allows them to get more revenue, which allows a lot of different things. And we just need to be more visible. We need equal perception with female athletes as these really awesome athletes, rather than, oh, like, you guys are cute, you're going to be mothers in the future. There's a perception of it. We need more media visibility. And I think one of the biggest arguments is that I'm not going to watch women's soccer because you're not as physical as the men. You're not as skilled as the men. But I read a book by Andrew Zimbalist, an economic professor, and he talked about that just isn't true. Why do people watch college football when NFL is 100 times better? Why do people go crazy over March Madness when NBA, they're more athletic, they're more skilled? It's people connect with teams and players because they're more visible. And we just don't get those same opportunities now. It's growing and we've made the right steps, but we are not there yet, and it makes me frustrated, but also grateful that we have these platforms to continue to talk about it. I play pickup every single day with guys, only guys, and I'm the only girl, and they love having me. They think that they're like, I wish I could play like you. You're smart, you're fast, and everyone's like, you're like the best player I've ever played with. And I was like, you don't even understand what kind of players I play with every single day. Like, yeah, it's just fascinating to see, and we need media, we need more voices, we need more platforms to raise awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, to add on to that, I'm really grateful for all the women who are fighting for gender equality, because I think that takes heart and strength. And I think they're setting the precedent for younger generations. So one of my pursuits with the U.S. Soccer Federation was to try and gain a governing role. And I think the way to do that and the way we were successful is, like, I started Next Gen United, which is a group of 5 young athletes of different races, genders, geographic locations, and abilities. One of them is a para-7-a-side member, and we wanted to make sure representation is a priority at every level. And the way you do that is by making sure that they have a voice in the highest and the governing bodies of our organization. So in terms of gender equality, how are we going to make decisions if we don't have empowered young women in the room who have the perspectives of what a 21st generation or 21st century athlete needs? We need to make sure that we're getting new and diverse perspectives in the room so that we can make decisions on behalf of everybody. And I think we learned a lot from this past election, and the way you do that is by rallying support from everybody. So the way we did that is by checking behind U.S. Soccer to make sure that they were reaching out to all eligible athletes. And I spent a lot of time going through World Cup rosters to make sure that every single eligible athlete has a vote in the Athlete Council election. And honestly, on one of the 2016 U20 roster for the Women's World Cup, under 20 World Cup team, they were missing 6 eligible athletes off of their eligible voter list. And that to me is a fundamental issue, because if we're going to have an election within our federation and we want to make sure that we're making sure that we're providing the resources that they need as athletes within our federation, they need to have an eligible vote, and we need to make sure that we're actively seeking them out to make sure that they're participating in our election. So even though that work is tedious, it matters. And I'm proud to say that my group with Next Gen United fostered the biggest support in the election and also led to the most votes. And we want to push for gender equality so that our women are getting the same resources as our men. Our youth women's national teams can go on the same trips and just enjoy the same experiences that the men get, because I really do think it will make a difference in the future.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I've seen the women's game grow. Obviously, I've seen just women's athletics grow in general. When I was a young player, you could hardly find women's sports on TV, and now it's a regular occurrence. And I think that's a big shift, and that's very important. I sat down with my daughters and watched the ACC soccer championship. We watch as much female content as we can. I think it's important for our generation who have now become parents, as well as fathers, is to help support women's sports by watching sports on television and by also going to games and buying tickets. Revenue drives everything. And if we can show participation from a fan perspective, then that's going to get the sponsors to pay attention, and that's going to get the television companies to pay attention. So it's important that we, as now the older generation, we educate our children on how it's important to support women's sports. And we take action. You have to take action in order to make that happen.
Thank you. So Nnenna, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Black Women's Sports Foundation and how that is creating some positive change.
Yeah, and I appreciate my fellow panelists here talking about a common theme, which is exposure and opportunity, right? That equation, that combination really makes a difference. And we try to embed that practice in our programming. Right, so how do we really facilitate exposure for communities that are often ignored? And those communities generally tend to be majority Black, Black and Brown, BIPOC communities, urban communities. So how do we close that gap and create opportunity for exposure? A lot of folks don't see themselves in these sports, right? The impact of not having the broader media exposure, like we named. Let alone when you start to layer on some of these intersecting identity elements like race on top of gender, right? So women are only getting a portion of exposure. And then you might not even see yourself in many sports as a young girl of color. So how do we kind of go to community and create opportunities for exposure, work in partnership with organizations like USA Triathlon to say, how do we get more Black women into the triathlon circuit, and being very intentional and thoughtful about scholarship programming, fundraising, and educational programming too, right? And a lot of NGBs actually do a phenomenal job of educational programming, and our role is facilitating access to community. So how do we take some of the content and information you're creating and bring it into community? And the example I gave with USA Triathlon is an example of how we're doing that in some ways. And then more broadly, it's advocacy, right? How do we advocate for conversations like this? How do we advocate and elevate and amplify the voices of athletes? There are so many ways and examples that we can point to currently where women are leading conversations in our country, where women athletes are leading conversation in our country, where women of color who are athletes are leading conversations in our country. So our role is to amplify those voices by hosting panel opportunities and dialogues, and actually having conversations with NGBs and other leaders to say, this is important. How are you going to prioritize this? You did a phenomenal job of posting that Black square in June. So we want to follow up with you and talk about how you can actually articulate that value in concrete ways to impact the experiences of Black women and girls.
Thanks, everyone. So we have a few questions from the audience, and I will start with, I think it's a good segue to this question. Nnenna, your discussion. What advice would you have for men who want to advocate for racial and gender equality in sport without stealing space? So anyone is free to jump in on that one.
I always try to lead by saying, ask people what they need. So oftentimes we frame advocacy as like, I feel called to action. I have to do something right now. And then we jump into action. But if we are truly kind of practicing equity, and equity as a practice is giving folks what they need, right? Ask people what they need, and you don't have to worry about erasure. You don't have to worry about silencing voices, because a community might need an out front advocate. They might need somebody who can gain access to spaces and amplify voices. The community might need somebody who's an ally alongside, right? And walking hand in hand. A community might actually need somebody who's behind, right? And just providing support in ways that are less visible. But you don't know unless you ask. So if you have proximity to some of these marginalized communities, ask folks what they need. What do you need in this instance? If what I can do for you is amplify your voice, is provide more opportunities for media exposure for women's sports, then let me think about ways I can do that strategically. Let me think about ways I could name that publicly. Let me think about ways that I can advocate behind the scenes and talk to the right players and leaders to get that thing done. But really decentering yourself is the language we use in kind of social justice spaces. Decenter yourself and ask communities what they need is a great strategy.
Thanks, Nnenna. Anyone else?
The thing I would add is, like, my family's always been keen, especially my dad, on taking us to women's sporting events. And that's something our whole family's enjoyed. So even if you don't have daughters, bring your sons, bring your friends to these sporting events and really support them by buying tickets, buying jerseys, and investing in the sport as a whole, because I really do think that the experience is fantastic, and you can learn so much from what these women are fighting for on and off the field. So that's all I would add.
Thanks, Brianna. Kim?
I just would second that about being a participant as much as you can. And I know that there are many organizations that have heightened awareness about this, about equality, and how can we get there? That's the big question, is how can we get there? So I just, for anybody that wants to help and wants to be an advocate, doing research, finding ways that you can align yourself with things or items that are important to you, there are plenty of organizations and ways to do that. It just takes action.
Great, thank you. So another question from the audience. So a male sports fan of women's sports since our audience member began teaching in 1974 at Queens College. And he says, at the time, Queens had one of the best women's basketball teams in the US. It's hard not to notice terms that so far aren't being used in this discussion: sexism, misogyny, racism, and homophobia. He felt in 1974 and still feels today that these bigotries are at the heart of resistance to women's sports and discrimination against women throughout the sports world. Any responses to that comment question?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, I think it's hard to really talk about equity in concrete terms when women's sports or subsequently men's sports had a 150 year head start, right? So all of those things that we see in society. So when we talk about the way social justice manifests, all the things that we see in society show up in sport. Many people see sport as one of these last bastions of concrete, like measurable, explicit systemic bias, systemic racism, systemic sexism. In fact, some of those isms, those levels of bias and discrimination are affirmed in many ways by sport. So it is something that's necessary to continue to reconcile. If we're not talking about the way discrimination shows up in sport and in women's sport explicitly, we're missing the mark, because sport was built on those narratives. Sport was built on those structures. Sport was built explicitly to have an in-group and an out-group. And oftentimes that out-group are women and folk of color.
Thanks, Nnenna. Does anyone else have any comments on that question? Paige?
I mean, yeah, I still see it as a problem today. I see tweets talking about they should just be done playing sports and go back into the kitchen. Everyone's commenting on outfits with Venus and Serena Williams, and these athletes are incredible athletes, and you never see that with male players. So you do see a lot of sexism, and it's panels like these that help in try and promote like incredible athleticism with women, but it's also it goes back to the media and pushing and asking for corporations to help out of. So a lot of like ads, newspapers, TVs, they highlight men athletes usually in action, like throwing the basketball or something, and women, the numbers are a lot lower than that, and they're usually doing something like in the house as like mothers. And so we still see that a lot today. And Title IX was passed in 1972 to give equal opportunities for athletics for both men and women, yet that perception is still like you should still be mothers maybe, and there's still a lot of shame with people like being mothers and trying to be athletes. So it's about changing this perception of how we see female athletes, and that just takes a lot of conversations and advocacy and going to the media, corporations to help with that.
Thanks, Paige. So I think that transitions well into, we've got quite a few questions from the audience, which is great. Thanks so much. So another question here, over the next 5 years, what do you see as minimum progress needed, reasonable expectation of progress, and super success? How important are dimensions like media coverage and sports betting to broader opportunities for female athletes? Does one of the athletes want to start on that, either Paige or Brianna? And actually, Paige, maybe since you're playing on a professional soccer team and the NWSL is still sort of at its beginning with Lisa Baird at the helm, what do you see in the next 5 years for you and other professional athletes?
Yeah, Lisa Baird has done an incredible job. We actually got on a TV network, a popular one, CBS this year, and Twitch, which is awesome. And our viewership numbers were up 493%, where NBA, NFL, actually, they were down this year. And so that's incredible growth. However, we have a long ways to go. We're still seeing less than 10% on TV. And I think it's like half and half, 50% of women play sports, 50% of men play sports. So we're not even close to getting the right visibility that we need in order to help with revenues, help with profits, help with stable leagues. And we have incredible people fighting for our behalf of awesome ownership for all these clubs. And now we have a new team in LA who's all women ownerships, which is going to be very helpful with having a voice. But yeah, it's asking these media companies not maybe to be 50% and 50% on TV, because that can't just happen overnight. It's asking maybe 20%, 15% more airtime on different networks. It's asking corporate sponsors. I think still 99 or 98% of all corporate sponsors still go to men. We only get 2%, which it's crazy to think after all of that, we still generate, the US women's soccer team still generates billions of dollars of revenue after all of that. So we are fighting, we are working, and we just need more visibility. So yeah, it's just asking for slower increases that we haven't really seen in the past.
Thanks, Paige. I think Nnenna has some follow-up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paige, you articulated it right. One of the things you mentioned earlier is this notion of like the derogatory comments that women's sport coverage often get. Those kind of archaic, go back to the kitchen jokes. But it speaks to a broader issue of like the exposure that you've discussed is critically important, because if we can shift that narrative more globally to normalize coverage of women's sports, it shifts everything else. It shifts the climate, it shifts the culture, it shifts and shapes perception. I said earlier that exposure and opportunity are the name of the game. And I think if we're looking at long-term success, the ways that women's leagues, women's teams can leverage innovation to say, how do we take advantage of exposure, media exposure and media opportunity? There was an interesting article, I think a couple of weeks ago from New York Times that talked about how that the few women's athletes at the collegiate level who've actually been able to take advantage of endorsement deals are cheerleaders, because they're not governed by the NCAA, right? So they're really able to kind of lean into this social media era and take advantage of what does it look like to kind of leverage endorsement deals. There have been studies that have said if the NCAA is really progressive around name, image, and likeness, many of the athletes that would benefit would be women, right? Prominent women athletes. So how do we think about 5 years down the line, 3 years down the line, leveraging some of these shifting policies and practices in college sports, and then subsequently in professional sports, professional leagues, taking advantage of how do we align with the right partners, gain visibility with the right brands, and continue to invest in coverage and normalization of women's sports.
Thanks, Nnenna. Anyone else want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is just talking about like progress looks like every girl's going on TV and seeing themselves and envisioning themselves being at that level one day. And right now, if you can't see it, it's really hard to believe that you could one day reach that level. And that's what media representation is all about. We want to put people in places where they can be seen at the highest level doing what they love. And we want more women, more young girls to aspire to reach those levels. And the way to support them in their development as children and teenagers is to give them the resources they need to support those teams, and then uplifting the women who are at that level. So that's different socioeconomic backgrounds, that's different races, that's different religions, and we want to see that representation at every level, including on social media channels. And sponsors can be super helpful by supporting those women and giving them sponsorship rights so that they can be represented beyond their sports or playing field. And seeing them in ads and newspapers is a better way to get progress and get eyes on women's sports, because they do truly have so much to offer.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in on that because I'm a female. I'm coaching a men's team in men's soccer in the NCAA. There's over 800 men's colleges playing soccer, and there's one female coach. And I definitely benefited from just progressive thinking and leadership at the institution that I work, which is NYU. I happen to report directly to a female, and a senior athletic director. At the time of my hiring, though, the athletic director was a male. So we have to have people in those positions that think differently and are open-minded to breaking these barriers and giving opportunities to women who are deserving.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm going to go to another question from the audience. And this one is from a graduate student at Loyola University who is from Nairobi. So as sports athletes and ambassadors, how can you enhance national identity, consciousness, and cohesion among diverse groups? Maybe Brianna, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think Nnenna touched on it a lot about doing outreach in different communities and making sure that we're introducing diverse groups to non-traditional sports such as field hockey, lacrosse, and so on. And we want to make sure that we're offering opportunities for them to play sports at the highest level as well. And the ways to do that is by making sure that this opportunity that we're offering reaches every type of person. Building onto that, Cohesion is seeing representation in media outlets. And again, I think social media is a huge tool of today's age. And it's a great way to show women in all the best lights. And we want to make sure that we're using that as an asset so that we can continue to promote growth in all of these sports.
Kim, how about your perspective from college sports?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I got a little distracted. It said University of Chicago. That's like my biggest rival in my conference. I was like, that
no problem.
Came out in me. I'm sorry.
Hopefully that won't taint your answer. So the question is, as athletes and ambassadors, how can you enhance national identity, consciousness, and cohesion among diverse groups?
Wow, that's I think it's just by being willing to be out here and making ourselves available and doing these types of things, these types of forums. You know, the more that we see as a society, the more that it's normal. And I just think normalizing these things helps us progress in a very, very significant way.
I have something to add. I think a lot of times the cohesion in different groups stems from a leader, right? So admins, coaches, having more diversity in coaches. Let's talk about the WNBA. There's 4 women head coaches, 8 men's head coaches, 2 men Black head coaches, while 88% of all players are Black women. And only a few played professionally. And it doesn't really make sense because no player makes it to the WNBA without an incredibly high basketball IQ, and most have college degrees and show strong leadership in other businesses outside. How can we get more women coaches, more women Black coaches, more administrators, more owners with different backgrounds, with being more diverse? I think that could really help build a better cohesive, I guess, understanding around sport.
Yeah, this has been one of my biggest challenges as an older generation player and now coaching. More and more jobs are going to male. Even in the NWSL, it's like where are all the female coaches, right? You know, how do we get them on board, and how do we get them in those environments where they deserve to be and they can be more visible? It's obviously a huge problem, and Title IX sort of opened the door to expanding the number of women's sports, which was very, very positive. But then we started to see the number of female coaches disappear because the money became big, the salaries became big, and men moved from male sports, from coaching male sports into coaching female sports.
Yeah, I think men are getting paid 42% more than women's coaches. And maybe that's what makes women not want to be coaches. It's less money, less respect. And there's a lot of value in your team that respects you. I don't know.
And I think I'll just add to the reality is, I mean, to this question about how do you create communities of cohesion in sport? I think oftentimes, again, we think that sport just does that naturally. Like, you have to be intentional about it, right? So absolutely right. The equation is having diverse, thoughtfully diverse leadership who are competent, capable, and skilled. Those pipelines exist. I don't care what anybody says that there aren't pipelines of qualified, diverse candidates. They are out there. I think that's one part of the recipe, but it's also the philosophy, right? How do I facilitate cohesion? And it's not by having everybody check their identity at the door, or colorblind leadership, or again, when some of those archetypes of sport. It's about how do you really enhance your competencies in interpersonal development? How do you meet people where they are, create environments where they feel like they can be their best selves, and invest in a common goal because they have a lot of belief. And even in programs and teams that have a lot of success, imagine how much more successful that they might be if you allow people to really be their best selves and if they felt seen and affirmed, right? And that's how you create communities of cohesion. It's not easy. And they're not natural competencies that a lot of coaches and leaders take into space, or even team leaders and captains take into space. They're skills that you have to practice like any other sport skill. You have to flex that muscle of like, how do I really work directly with athletes, see them where they are, have difficult conversations, make sure they know that I respect their full selves, and then do that with everybody to bring us together for a common goal.
Thanks, Nnenna. So another question, lots of great questions from the audience. So thanks so much for that. A question here. Sorry, just looking for it. What are your thoughts on transgender individuals participating in women's sport? Any thoughts on that? Nnenna, I see you nodding your head. So why don't we start with you?
I'm trying not to commandeer the mic. I think trans inclusion is critically important, and we have to create space for it, and we have to have the hard conversations with ourselves. We've created a system in sport where our sports are gendered, so it's complicated, right? But we have to allow space for every individual, no matter how they identify, to participate and have access to those opportunities. So what does that look like? How do we allow spaces for trans women to participate? Governing bodies, the IOC, they have a lot of very archaic and complicated practices, policies, approaches that aren't necessarily inclusive and aren't necessarily thoughtful about the diversity of gender identity and expression. So we have to marry the more affirmative conversations we're having about gender identity and expression with our very archaic system of sport. We have to figure out a way to marry those things, because there are athletes that are being left out and being marginalized and not gaining access to opportunity. So I don't profess to have all of the answers, nor do I profess to be an expert on gender identity and gender inclusion. There are very competent and skilled, capable people who are, including trans athletes themselves. So they need to have a seat at the table, and we need to be having conversations about how do we create space for inclusion.
Sorry, I guess I have to unmute myself. Thanks, Nnenna. I'd be interested, Kim, in hearing from you on this issue in the context of college sports.
Well, again, this is an important topic, and more inclusion is always better. These will be very, very difficult to tackle and to talk about, but it will require leadership from the NCAA. It will require leadership from the students in the NCAA. But I do think that it will be possible, and it will open more doors for more participation, which is only positive.
And I think the last thing I'll just add is minimally what we can do is think about how do we create accommodating spaces for trans inclusion. Like that's minimally, I think every institution, college sports, governing body, we can minimally talk about how do we create affirmative spaces where people feel comfortable that they can be their best selves. There's a concept that comes out of the disability rights movement, universal design. And universal design basically talks about when we design communities and strategies and processes for the most marginalized, it benefits everybody. It simply benefits everybody. So if we design sport for folks who are on the margins of access, it'll benefit everybody. So just thinking about the minimum things that we can do to accommodate experiences so people feel comfortable and affirmed and that they have access to resources.
Thanks, Nnenna. So question for the athletes, and I know everyone is an athlete at some point, but maybe for the active athletes here. So talk to us a little bit about efforts to reclaim formerly sort of demeaning language about women participating in sport, like "you play like a girl," and to overcome gender stereotypes. Do you see any of that happening now in sport?
Yeah, I do think reclaiming those statements are important. I think playing like a girl is great, to be honest, because there's so many amazing female athletes out there that you can hold as a role model. And reclaiming those statements, I think, changes the narrative in a positive way, because when people use it in a demeaning way and you take it, internalize it, and then use it as your motivation to continue to have success, that's when they see that you can't be overtaken with words. And we will continue to prove time and time again that we are strong and empowered women who will succeed at any given obstacle. And I think we saw that with Sarah Fuller at Vanderbilt. And I was really, really proud to see that, even as a fan, because she took steps that haven't been taken before, and she owned it, and she showed the world what it's like to play like a girl in a sport that's dominated by men.
Yeah, I think just language and perceptions are vital in overcoming gender stereotypes. I don't know how I feel about play like a girl. I know the language is changing, and a lot of parents are doing a really good job with their kids. And there's a lot of boys that watch women's soccer games, and they're like, "Oh, she's an amazing soccer player." It's not, "She's an amazing female soccer player" anymore. But like Brianna pointed out, it's how do we just change that in a positive way? So there used to be a negative stigmatism with a female soccer player, but can we just change that to be like that? That's a really cool thing to be. And yeah, and again, back to what I was saying earlier, the media has to play a role with the pictures, with the ESPN body issue is like very controversial. It's portraying athletes not as like these soft, vulnerable mothers. It's portraying them skillful, having massive leadership qualities. It's all about the language that these media sites, put out to everyone. That we're always online, we're always reading, we're always watching these TV things, and so that creates a very important role for the media.
Thanks, Paige. So I think we have time for two more questions, and the first of those is from a friend of mine, a fellow lawyer, arbitrator, and athlete, Jill Pilgrim. So if you all could comment on colleges cutting sports due to COVID and the impact that's had on women's sports.
Well, yeah, I can take that, because some of the casualties have been men's soccer programs being cut entirely from the university. There's been a lot of Olympic sports, minor sports that we really don't hear about until we get to the Olympics, but they're so important for the development of our athletes in order to succeed at that level. And colleges are sponsoring them, and they're investing in them, and they're being cut. And, the big conversation has to be around men's football, because men's college football teams have upwards of 100 and 115 players on their squads. And that immediately jeopardizes Title IX. There has to be equity in that number. And so what colleges have done primarily in the past is that they have cut men's sports and blamed it on Title IX, blamed it on women's sports, blamed it on having to fund that, instead of really taking a hard look at big programs, big football programs, and the number of players that they have on it. And so that is the big question, is how do we get the athletic directors and the big conferences to think differently about ways that they can balance their athletic programs by not cutting men's sports and blaming it on Title IX. And I think that those are very, very serious issues that have been talked about for a long time, but it seems to be trending still in the same direction where sports are cut and not football.
Yeah, I agree, Kim. And the reality is the Department of Education actually discourages cutting sports to meet Title IX compliance. It is a strategy, but it's not a strategy that the DOE supports and the OCR supports, right? So you are absolutely right. We have to talk about football is the great moneymaker. Football also operates on razor thin margins, right? So the success or failure of football means the collapse of college sports as we know it. And that's perhaps not a model that's going to work for the sustainability of college sports, period. And it's not just in just the simple sports sponsorship, travel and accommodations. It's the great arms race and facilities. It's institutions taking on hundreds of millions of dollars of debt related to supporting and uplifting football programs. Again, because it's the cash cow, it seems like a worthwhile investment short-term, but long-term consequences is when we have COVID, the entire system collapses. So in my estimation, we have to think radically different about the way we've built this system, right? And we know that there are models that make sense because it shows up in Division III sports, it shows up in small college sports, it shows up in the NAIA. There are ways to have a healthy relationship between sport and higher education, right? But the revenue model that we've built sport on and the dependency, and the reality is the NCAA takes on a lot of the liability and cost of football, but doesn't gain any of the revenue from that because it's operated by a separate body, right? That revenue is distributed and managed by a separate body. So what the name of the game of what feeds everything really is men's college basketball. So this circular, strange model, financial model that we've built sport on is impossible. And ultimately the folks that suffer are Olympic sports, like men's soccer, to Kim's point, women's sports, and smaller divisional college sports as well. So I don't know what the solution is. I don't know what the way forward is, but I know that making small adjustments to the current model won't cut it.
Thank you. So last question, and maybe we can hear from each of the panelists on this. I think this is a good question to end on. And I'll just mention that for the audience, if you take a look in the chat, you will see an email as well as a link for additional information about DC Dialogues. So last question. How do we attract minoritized individuals to leadership roles in sports when the existing leadership team is predominantly white? And I'm going to say also male. Who'd like to start? Kim, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, that's obviously a huge question, but an important one. And I just think it starts with, first of all, recognizing that there's a problem, and then taking action to make a difference. And again, I work at NYU. It's a wonderful institution. They recognize that there are problems. And so how can we be impactful? What are some of the things that we can do to take action to make a difference? And for me personally, I recruit male athletes. And so I have to open my mind to how I'm recruiting and where I'm recruiting. And how much am I uncovering these marginalized kids in society, and how can I go find them? And how can NYU give me the tools and the resources I need to be successful in opening doors for those who deserve it?
Thanks, Kim. Paige?
Yeah, where do I start? I think there's a problem. The problem starts with the lack of access to open positions, and most of the hiring for these jobs is done mainly by men. So we need just more female mentorship. This push to try and get more female coaches. Obviously, I shared earlier that usually women get paid less, and there's one more thing where people are like, oh, women shouldn't be coaches, they have to travel a lot and they can't do that while raising a family. So there's a lot of perceptions about how they can balance a coaching life with a personal life. And I think the main important thing is to increase female mentorship, to try and get females and other minority groups into these positions. There's no direct answer to this, but there's a lot of things we can do to increase access and opportunities for these positions.
Thanks, Paige.
The thing I would add is that I'm a direct beneficiary of mentorship programs of all kinds, and I felt like the support I need to go pursue those lengthy dreams, those dreams that don't seem tangible. And I think if women pursue elected positions maybe and rally a group of people who have the same ideals, that's a starting point. But again, as Kim said, we have to see the fundamental issues at stake where white males typically dominate a lot of these fields, and we need to make sure that we support ourselves in numbers and generate a group of people who are pushing for change, because strength in numbers does work. And if we just encourage and support the next generation of athletes and women and pull them along as we continue this charge in making change, I think that's the best way we can progress as a.
Thanks, Brianna. So Nnenna, let's hear from you now.
Yeah, my response is simple, right? Because I don't care what anybody says, this isn't my opinion. Hiring in leadership in sport, professional, amateur, college, is not a meritocracy. It's just not. It's about proximity and who's in your circle. So the first way to address that is addressing the not the pipeline issue, but who manages the pipeline, which at major college sports and professional sports are search firms, executive search firms. Hold executive search firms accountable for the pools they create. There are so many studies about bias in search processes that talk about when there's only one minority, what be that a woman or ethnic minority in a pool, they're actually less likely to get hired, right? So we have to hold search firms and other search bodies accountable for the pools that they create. So I think that's part of the issue. People have to diversify their networks. So if you're building a short list of, if I know I have a football vacancy or a soccer vacancy, or I know if this W team has a vacancy, I know who my short list is. That's why you see the same coaches get recycled over and over and over again. Those short lists need to diversify, right? And there are people who have the capacity and capability. So we have to also shift our risk tolerance too. And be able to really invest in folks who are more traditionally underrepresented in leadership across sport. And then the last thing is, like, organizations, sports teams have to lead with their values. Why would I, as a queer identified person, a person of color, a woman, or whatever my identity is, why would I want to work for your organization if you are not living those values of inclusion, if I don't know that I'm going to be safe, if I don't know if I'm going to be supported, if I don't know that, like, if I've already calculated in my head that if I make a mistake, if I don't have success, I'm gone. And I've seen counterparts who don't have the same identities as me fail forward over and over again. And I don't have those same opportunities to fail forward, right? So organizations really, truly need to lead with their values. So candidates feel like this is a place where I can go and be set up for success.
Well, I think we are out of time, and I really want to, well, thanks to the audience for spending the last hour with us, and a big thanks to our panelists, Nnenna, Brianna, Kim, and Paige, as well as to the student team at DC Dialogues who made all of this happen. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.